Welcome to the World of Wodehouse, a series of podcasts from the PG Wodehouse Society, UK, to commemorate the work of PG Wodehouse on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of his death. I'm Alexander Armstrong, and I have the huge privilege of being president of the PG Wodehouse Society, UK, a literary society of enthusiasts that celebrates Wodehouse and his work. And it is my delightful duty to introduce the latest guest in this series of podcasts.
Hello, Nigel Rees here. Back in 2008, when I was invited to be a patron of the PG Wodehouse Society UK, I felt suitably honoured. When I looked at the distinguished names I was to be joining, I concluded that any organisation that could embrace Boris Johnson and me in this position was obviously very broad-minded and could suffer fools gladly. Then I looked forward to being supportive of the Society's goals and ideals. I had hoped that the position would carry with it reciprocal rights to membership of the Drones Club, but this appears not to have been the case. Now I have discovered that Boris Johnson is no longer a patron, so I shall have to behave myself in case the committee commits another patron cull. I know there is a ritual question asked of all the Society's patrons, and indeed anyone of any rank who wanders into the pages of Worcester Source, namely, what was your first Wodehouse experience? Well, I have to tell you that I can't remember. I'm certain that the first book of his that I actually purchased was a paperback of Summer Lightning, when I was up in Edinburgh in 1966, appearing in the Oxford Review before starting on my first job with Granada TV. I can't believe that I hadn't read a Jeeves story before this, but I'm afraid I simply cannot remember. So I had better come clean. The first encounter I can remember with the world of Worcester was with the World of Worcester in 1965. The very enjoyable BBC TV adaptations with Ian Carmichael as Bertie and Dennis Price as Jeeves and Fabia Drake as Aunt Agatha. You can't get better casting than that, even if Ian and Dennis were perhaps a little on the elderly side for the roles. But there is no getting away from it. My view of Jeeves and Bertie is still dictated by those two performances. In particular, whenever I quote a bit of Bertie, I tend to do it in the Carmichael voice, as you will discover. But how do I remember what that voice was like? The BBC famously wiped all but two, I think, of the videotapes back in the 1970s. To some of us, a crime of appalling proportions. But there's a good one on YouTube, and I have a copy of the signature tune that Sandy Wilson wrote for the TV series. What would I do without you, Jeeves? I'd get in the most frightful stew, Jeeves. There's terrible traps that destiny weaves and all that sort of rot. What would I do without you? And the record ends with Ian Carmichael saying, Jeeves, I've said this before and I shall say it again. You stand alone. Thank you, sir. So there we are. Now to business. We all have, I'm sure, our favourite PGW quotations, or nuggets, as they have come to be called following the pioneering work of Richard Usborne. In the 46 years I devised and presented the BBC Radio 4 quotations programme, Quote Unquote, I inevitably included scores of Plum's miniature masterpieces. Here are just a few that I'm particularly fond of. The drowsy stillness of the summer afternoon was shattered by what sounded to his strained senses like G.K. Chesterton falling on a sheet of tin. What ho, I said. What ho, said Motty. What ho, what ho. What ho, what ho, what ho. After that, it seemed rather difficult to go on with the conversation. Honoria is one of those robust, dynamic girls with the muscles of a welterweight and a laugh like a squadron of cavalry charging on a tin bridge. Alf Todd, said Eucridge, soaring to an impressive burst of imagery, has about as much chance as a one-armed blind man in a dark room trying to shove a pound of melted butter into a wild cat's left ear with a red-hot needle. It is never difficult to distinguish between a Scotsman with a grievance and a ray of sunshine, and Lord Emsworth was able to see at once into which category Angus McAllister fell. Now, I have to confess sometimes to preferring these delights in nugget form, even to whole pages of superlative Woodhouseian prose, and certainly to the full-length books. It's just that having your Wodehouse served up in tasty bite-sized chunks is like devouring a box of chocolates at one go, and probably about as good for you, but I don't know. I have to say that these Woodhouseian nuggets are not hugely represented in the major dictionaries of quotations. The Oxford has about 17 or so, but that's a long way behind equally prolific writers like Chesterton and Mark Twain. And the American Bartlett only fields about 6, as does the New American Yale Book of Quotations. Never mind, we know it is all immensely quotable, and if the editors of these dictionaries don't consider that Wodehouse has really entered into the mainstream of popular quotation and allusion, so be it. We know what we like. To quote Jeeves in the offing, "As the old saw has it, one man's caviar is another man's major general." And so to the other side of the quotations coin. It will be obvious to anyone who has read their Wodehouse the extent to which PGW quoted other writers. There are hundreds of familiar and less familiar quotations and allusions throughout the canon. In fact, at one point I created a list which included over 1,000 of them. And oh, what delight there is to be had from the merry mischief Wodehouse makes with them. From Right Ho Jeeves. But what can I say about the sunset? Asked Gussie. Well, Jeeves got off a good one the other day. I met him airing the dog in the park one evening, and he said, "Now fades the glimmering landscape on the sight, sir, and all the air a solemn stillness holds." You might use that. From Much Obliged Jeeves. "The snail's on the wing and the lark's on the thorn," or rather the other way round, as I've sometimes heard you say. On the face of it, few writers have employed literary allusions to the same extent as Wodehouse in his novels and short stories. He was undoubtedly well read, but he seems also to have used a short cut to the mighty lines he quoted and played about with. He admitted that he used a well-thumbed copy of Bartlett's familiar quotations. "Hello, fathead, what news on the Rialto?" Unusually, this is Aunt Dahlia plucking a line from The Merchant of Venice in Aunt's Aunt Gentleman. More usually, it is Bertie who is fumbling for the apt quotation and more often than not believing that Jeeves invented all the best lines. When Jeeves quotes, "It is a far, far better thing," Bertie comments, "As I said before, there is nobody who puts these things more neatly than he does." A quotation from Shakespeare is frequently accompanied by, "As I've heard Jeeves put it," or, to quote one of Jeeves's gags, for example, "leaving not a rack behind, as I remember Jeeves saying once." Although we all know that Jeeves is quite capable of reading Spinoza's Ethics, indeed he gets a complete edition of the annotated works, such faith in his ability to coin a neat phrase is strange in a Worcester educated at Eton and Oxford and winner of the Scripture Knowledge Prize. But, as Richard Usborne again pointed out in Wodehouse at Work, Bertie's frame of reference is no more than one would expect of an educated man in the early 20th century. And the same goes for Wodehouse himself, of course. There are lapses, though. The next moment, I was dropping like the gentle dew upon the place beneath. Or is it rain? Jeeves would know. And occasionally Bertie resorts, as so many of us do, to "as the fellow said." In one book he refers to the works of somebody called Wordsworth, Some quotations recur throughout the Jeeves canon, with a wild surmise probably crops up most often, and Bertie worries obsessively and understandably over the cat in the adage and fretful porpentine, two Shakespearean allusions. What is more, Wodehouse larded the novels with more and more literary allusions as he grew older. Jeeves in the Offing, published in 1960, contains no fewer than 50 or so. I've spent many years of my life worrying over the more obscure quotations and allusions, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. When you get this sort of thing, it's just plain balmy and at the same time sublime. The older I get, the more I agree with Shakespeare and those poet Johnnies about it always being darkest before the dawn, and there's a silver lining, and what you lose on the swings you make up on the roundabouts. And then this passage, alluding to Shakespeare's Cardinal Wolsey, used on more than one occasion, as in Jeeves and the Unbidden Guest. I'm not absolutely certain of my facts, but I rather fancy it's Shakespeare, or if not, it's some equally brainy bard, who says that it's always just when a fellow is feeling particularly braced with things in general that fate sneaks up behind him with a bit of lead piping. And what I'm driving at is that the man is perfectly right. Going back to the rich quotability of Wodehouse himself, I'm going to end by remarking on the fact that what we have doesn't seem to be enough for some people, so they make them up. Well, sometimes these confusions occur in the best of circles. When John Lloyd, the original producer of Quote Unquote, appeared on one of our anniversary editions, he came up with this supposed quote from Wodehouse. If it were not for quotations, conversation between gentlemen would consist of an endless succession of what-hos. Now, that might seem to have something to do with the what-ho nugget I mentioned earlier, but can we find it in the complete works? No. John Lloyd is now the man behind the TV show QI. I do hope he isn't having us on. So, we are 50 years on from PGW's death. That is irrelevant, because quite clearly he is immortal, accordingly. This is Nigel Rees exclaiming, "What ho! Toodle pip!" Don't you know?